Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 11 of Series 8. The question for today is, are the uncanny and the mysterious obfuscatory or revelatory features of consciousness? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 4. So my underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence as consciousness? In reply, I'm posing questions about consciousness and proposing answers in terms of value. That is, a principle of life as an affirmation or a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. And I claim that a certain grasp of consciousness is a step towards that outcome. So for the last few weeks, we have been looking at different ways of understanding consciousness. These were physicalism, phenomenology, existentialism, obfuscation, and various typologies. Today we're looking at mysteriousness and the uncanny as means of understanding consciousness. This isn't usual because mysteriousness and the uncanny are thought to prevent us from understanding consciousness. But some thinkers believe that mysteriousness and the uncanny can help us to understand consciousness. These include such thinkers as Ludwig Feuerbach, Martin Heidegger, and Theodor Adorno. So my intention is to use the uncanny and the mysterious to understand consciousness and to reveal something about it. And as noted before, we apprehend consciousness. How we apprehend consciousness depends on how consciousness apprehends itself. Yet, as previously explained, the apprehension of consciousness isn't an insignificant task. This is especially the case given the difficulties of apprehending consciousness as we have shown. Also, given that we are talking about the mysterious, we need to define our terms. I would like to first distinguish the mysterious, which implies that it can't be understood, from mysteriousness as a property that might well be understood. Next, the mysterious and the uncanny are related, but are different conditions that we must define at length. And as we will see, they are produced by reflective consciousness rather than by immediate consciousness. As for the mysterious, it is regarded as the incomprehensible or the unknown. Two examples of the mysterious are what was time before time began, or what happened to Amelia Earhart. The mysterious is also related to the difficulty of self-knowledge. Yet the uncanny can be defined as what is known but is strange and unsettling. The uncanny is also related to self-knowledge, or usually to self-consciousness. This is because one knows that one exists, but that existence is very extraordinary. Another example is finding yourself in a physical place that you knew as a child. It is the same place, but your knowledge of it is disrupted out of its former context. Taking this idea further, the researcher Sadak Rahimi describes the uncanny as expressing duplication, as in, for example, doppelgangers, ghosts, deja vu, alter egos, self-alienations, split persons, twins, and living dolls. These duplications involve two simultaneous aspects of perception and a relation to an alternate reality. For example, robots that are too lifelike, described as the syndrome of the uncanny valley. So the uncanny isn't just the unknown, it's the unbelievable, the unreal, or an incredible break with reality. One of my own experiences of the uncanny was that as a child I found the idea of Pinocchio traumatic. I could not accept how a wooden puppet could think and behave like a human. We have here the idea of an unreal duplication of a wooden puppet that thinks like a human. More, more philosophically, Heidegger uses the idea of the uncanny to pose the question of being. Heidegger's question of being can't be simply stated as why is there something rather than nothing. Heidegger claims that the question of being has been forgotten since the pre-Socratics, and he is attempting to work out the question of being in the whole of his book Being and Time. But Heidegger has many detractors. John Searle, for example, holds that using being as a noun is seriously problematic. And I agree, being is a misleading reification and a duplication of the totality of everything in the world. That is, in my view, the world is just the totality of things within it and doesn't imply a separate property of being. This appears to be a form of the category mistake advanced by Gilbert Ryle. Yet for our purposes, the uncanny can signify the existence of something against the possibility of nothing. And similarly, Hegel held that being must be understood in contrast to non-being. And even as a false duplication of the world, Heidegger's notion of being it illustrates the uncanny. But Heidegger is also interested in the being of Dasein as human consciousness revealed in the uncanny. He describes being in the world as uncanny, and that not being at home in the world provokes anxiety. He even writes that the uncanny pursues Dasein constantly as a threat. This is because Heidegger presents the uncanny as a means of revealing man to himself in anxiety. Both anxiety and the uncanny are certainly ways in which we experience and apprehend ourselves. Yet in my view, it is the duplication of consciousness as self-consciousness that makes it uncanny. Self-consciousness is uncanny due to this duplication that we are conscious that we exist. It is also uncanny because it is an undeniable fact that is hard to get to grips with. We discussed this problem of self-knowledge or obfuscation last week. The reflexive and self-duplicating character of consciousness is expressed another way by Oral Kolnai. Kolnai writes about the double intentionality of consciousness which can attend to both object and the self. Kolnai shows, for example, how disgust differs from fear when they attend to both the object of fear and self-interest. My point is that, like double intentionality, the uncanny reveals something about consciousness. Firstly and trivially, but overlooked, human consciousness is self-conscious or reflective consciousness. Secondly, that double intentionality and the uncanny reveals ways in which consciousness apprehends itself. And thirdly, that the uncanny is an experience which indicates a certain apprehension of consciousness. Next, consciousness is mysterious as well as the uncanny, because it involves a peculiar difficulty of self-understanding. That is, we are uniquely familiar with ourselves, yet our knowledge of ourselves is obscure. For example, I know that I exist, but who is the known and who is the knower? The adage, know yourself, is hailed from the ancient Greeks to Sigmund Freud. But mysteriousness is more than the unknown, illustrated by examples from several thinkers below. In these examples, I take mysticism a kind of institutionalization of mysteriousness. So Freud describes mysticism as having a sense of oneness with the universe. Bertrand Russell described the mystical outlook as one of the interrelatedness of things, and Wittgenstein talked about mysteriousness as feeling the world as a limited whole. Wittgenstein also said that there are things that cannot be put into words, they are what is mystical. I would ask whether they can't be put into words for practical reasons or in principle. In my view, almost anything can be put into words, but can't because of practical reasons. But my more relevant question is, are they mystical because they can't be described, rather than being a mystery that can't be described? My view is that just not being able to describe them attributes them with mystery. And these examples of mysteriousness and mysticism are of a particular kind of apprehension. To explain, I previously discussed two kinds of apprehension: standard and a kind of attenuated apprehension. Standard apprehension or perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. That is, like a black spot on a white board that can't be perceived if it was a white spot. It is the contrast that makes the perception possible. Non-standard perception, such as in the cases above, uses attenuated apprehension or attenuated cognition. This is the case of minimal contrasts in limited context or backgrounds of understanding. Examples of such are apprehending the universe, being, God, and flying saucers. My point is that mysteriousness can be explained as attenuated cognition. Yet the point that I want to make is that consciousness is a prime example of attenuated cognition and mystery. But I will digress slightly here, so you might want to ignore the following few lines. What I could say is that attenuated cognition results from the phenomenon of degrees of cognition. And the notion of degrees of cognition follows from a graduated conception of mind and mental states. Many examples can be found, such as degrees of belief as well as backgrounds of understanding. I previously noted attenuated cognition as a moral criterion in ideological frameworks. A related concept is distributed cognition in group thinking or even books. What I'm doing here is using ideas like the uncanny and the mysteriousness to explicate consciousness, and these ideas can be developed with structures and a structural conception of consciousness. So in my view, divisibility is a structure of consciousness that explains contrast as a product of consciousness. Yet divisibility can also explain a lot of other things, like individual existence, value, and number. Graduation is also a structure of consciousness that explains cognitive attenuation. And again, graduation also explains degrees of belief, free will, and other experiences, not to mention the development of mind in individuals and species. And lastly, insularity explains that condition of consciousness that we are ontologically separate individuals. Yet here, it also explains a kind of singular reference that we have in apprehending ourselves. So I want to get back to my primary case of consciousness as not just attenuated cognition, but as singular reference. That is, when consciousness apprehends itself in self-consciousness, it can only do this as a singular reference. And again, this attenuated cognition or singular reference explains the mysteriousness of consciousness. This is because self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other minds in the same way that it apprehends itself. self-consciousness experience itself in a way that it does not experience objects or other people. The pains and pleasures of other people are not the immediate pains and pleasures of oneself. That is, I recognize my own existence a priori, but I recognize other things a posteriori. So I repeat that self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. So self-consciousness experiences an extreme form of attenuated cognition. And consciousness is mysterious because it experiences a kind of attenuated cognition. The significance of attenuated cognition as mysterious, as a mysteriousness, can be illustrated in another way. The contrast, context, or background usually required by perception is denied to self-consciousness. This is because self-consciousness should not be able to exist, but it does exist, which is incredible. But consciousness finds a way of apprehending itself through holistic complexity and endless cycles of feedback loops. My point here is that this mysteriousness is a certain kind of perception that we have of consciousness, and that the uncanny and the mysterious are ways of apprehending consciousness. That is, either as the duplication or as the attenuated cognition of self-consciousness. This isn't the same thing as things being mysterious because we simply don't understand them. Moreover, for self-consciousness, background reference isn't just attenuated, but is practically absent. A further example to illustrate this idea can be found in the concept of personal identity. That is, the concept of personal identity provides another illustration of the uncanny and the mysterious. Yet the philosophical questions of identity and personal identity are standard philosophical issues. But what is it that determines the identity of an object? Is it unique properties, location in space of time? Is it just a matter of linguistic designation? Or is it a function of the observing consciousness? Is Neurath's boat, rebuilt at sea, plank by plank, the same one that he left home with? Yet personal identity also involves a sense of the uncanny. There is incomprehensibility and strangeness of finding oneself to be a self-conscious being. Personal identity evokes questions like, why am I here and not there? Why am I myself and not someone else? These aren't academic questions, they are experiences indicative of a certain awareness or perception. And again, the uncanny is found in an inexplicable duplication between reality and possibility. What I'm saying is that these philosophical issues ask us to consider mystery, mysticism, and mythology. For example, Theodore Adorno writes, myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology. That is, what we are doing here is reverting to mythology to find clues that philosophy can't provide. Mysticism is an embodiment of the mysterious, and religion is a domestication of mysticism. Religion is mankind's initial response to both the unknown and to the mysterious. Yet religion is also a mythological account with advantages over philosophy and science. For example, God represents the believer's highest values, illustrating them and tracing their advance. This is mythology unhindered by science, logic and reason to express unconscious dreams and aspirations. Mysticism and religion thereby provide potential access to the mystery of consciousness. More can be said with the demythologizations of Feuerbach, Bultmann, Don Cupid, and others. In Ludwig Feuerbach's projection theory of religion, God is mankind's projection of himself outside of himself. Mankind thereby comes to know and understand himself through his self-projection as God. In Feuerbach's words, knowledge of God is self-knowledge, and God is the mystery through which mankind comes to understand himself. More specifically, God represents the believer's highest values and thereby tracks changes in value over time. And particular concepts of God represent human aspirations that have been largely hidden. This is because religious mythology can express ideas and values that elude conceptual thought. For instance, God is defined as a believer's highest value by Saint Anselm, Descartes, Spinoza, and others. Yet theologians define God as self-sufficient, necessary being, a first cause and ground of existence. Divine characteristics are also those of omniscience, omnipotence, and supreme good. Now, these are all expressions of sufficiency of a highest conceivable value. And my own principle of life is the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. But this genealogy isn't the only reason why I advocate this principle. Further parallels can be found between existentialism and Gnosticism, but prominent among the mystery religions. In Heidegger, for example, Dasein is thrown into the world, a standard phrase in Gnostic writings. Nietzsche declares the death of God, yet the Gnostic God is also absent from the world. Both emphasize alienation, anxiety, dread, and forlornness in the world. And existentialists often talk about being and existence in terms of enlightenment and salvation. Heidegger's ontology is often described as ontotheology, and he speaks of blasphemy against being. Sartre speaks of an ethics of deliverance and salvation, achieved only after a radical conversion. This is the language of religious mythology spoken by existentialists. Gnostics seek the mystical experience of gnosis. Existentialists seek the inexpressible lived experience. And both Gnosticism and existentialism are engaging with the mystery of existence. So two different schools of thought are brought together here so we might better understand consciousness. Firstly, the singular way in which consciousness apprehends itself can be understood as mysteriousness. So the mysteriousness of mysticism and mythology make these approaches appropriate for the apprehension of consciousness. I previously explained how phenomenology is also an appropriate approach to consciousness. This is because the phenomenological method is one that describes the appearance of phenomena. And Sartre and others have often defined consciousness as pure appearance. Religion also unwittingly illustrates the problem of self-obfuscation, that is, the problem of knowing oneself as consciousness. I argued last week that consciousness tends to forget itself and overlook its own existence. Religious projection is also one of the greatest illustrations of this error. The problem of apprehending consciousness as self-awareness is presented in religious metaphor and mythology. For example, Paul the Apostle to the Athenians said, "In him, that is God, we live and move and have our being." Human consciousness is like fish, unaware of the water they swim in and are immersed in. Yet I've argued elsewhere that religious mythology is one way to understand consciousness. This last comment raises the question of an appropriate method for understanding consciousness. We can see that religious mythology has serious limitations as well as advantages in this respect. And I have long advocated phenomenology as my preferred method despite its failings. By contrast, analytic philosophy and even postmodernism stand out as being inadequate approaches to consciousness. They have physicalist inclinations which often even become denials of consciousness. That is, in the form of eliminative materialism and disappearance theories of mind. Other approaches like functionalism and behaviorism attempt to ignore mind. These physicalist and analytic approaches have crucial consequences with respect to method. Physicalism assumes a scientific method of precision, quantification and ungraduated single dimensionality. And insistence on such principles ensure that consciousness will not be understood. So theorists like Sam Harris and Stuart Sutherland end up thinking that consciousness is not understood and may never be understood. It isn't contentious to claim that different kinds of subject matter call for different methods of approach. Mathematics and logic employ abstract and necessary relations to which we can apply pure reason. Physics deals with material matters with contingent relations requiring empirical observation. Consciousness requires a direct approach appropriate to our first-hand experience of it. I've already outlined phenomenology as providing the details of such an approach. My conclusion is that the uncanny and the mysterious give us more ways of understanding consciousness, and that the uncanny and the mysteriousness of consciousness are explained by duplication and attenuated cognition produced by self-consciousness itself, and that these features can be more deeply understood by structures of consciousness such as divisibility, graduation and singularity. Yet the key idea in this analysis of the uncanny and the mysterious is that self-consciousness is unable to reference other minds in the same way that it references itself, nor is it able to reference itself in the same way that it references other objects. Yet the experience of the uncanny and the mysterious nevertheless indicates a profound encounter with consciousness, and these experiences stimulate different kinds of questions such as how should we respond to this experience, what can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness, and what are the limits and possibilities of consciousness. Next week we'll look at self-consciousness as a form of discovery that could be described as enlightenment. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.